Section 12 of the South Pole. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recorded by Ken Campbell. The South Pole by Roald Amundsen. Translation by A.G. Carter. Section 12, Volume 1, Chapter 5. On the Barrier, Part 2. On January 17th, the carpenters began to dig the foundations of the house. The effect of all that we had heard about the Antarctic storms was that we decided to take every possible precaution to make the house stand on an even keel. The carpenters, therefore, began by digging a foundation 4 feet down into the barrier. This was not easy work. 2 feet below the surface they came upon hard, smooth ice, and had to use pickaxes. The same day a stiff easterly breeze sprang up, whirling the snow high into the air and filling up the foundations as fast as the men dug them. But it would take more than that to stop those fellows at their work. They built a wind screen of planks and did it so well that they were able to work all day, unhindered by the drifts, until when evening came they had the whole foundation dug out. There is no difficulty in doing good work when one has such people to work for one. The stormy weather interfered somewhat with our sledging, and as we found our Alaska harness unsuitable to the conditions, we went on board and began the preparation of Greenland harness for our dogs. All hands worked at it. Our excellent sailmaker Ronnie sewed 46 sets of harnesses in the course of the month. The rest of us spliced the ropes and made the necessary tackles, while others spliced wire rope shafts to our sledges. When evening came, we had an entirely new set of tackles for all our sledges and dogs. This was very successful, and in a few days the whole was working smoothly. We had now divided ourselves into 2 tents, so that 5 men slept in the lower tent, while the 2 carpenters and I inhabited the upper one. That evening a rather amusing thing happened to us. We were just turning in when suddenly we heard a penguin's cry immediately outside the tent. We were out in a moment. There, a few yards from the door, sat a big emperor penguin, making bow after bow. It gave exactly the impression of having come up simply to pay us respects. We were sorry to repay its attention so poorly, but such is the way of the world. With a final bow, it ended its days in the frying pan. On January 18th, we began bringing up the materials for the hut, and as soon as they arrived, the builders began to put them up. It is no exaggeration to say that everything went like a well-oiled machine. One sledge after another drove up to the site and discharged its load. The dogs worked splendidly, and their drivers no less, and as fast as the materials arrived, our future home rose into the air. All parts had been marked before leaving Norway, and were now discharged from the ship in the order in which they were wanted. Besides which, Stubberud himself had built the house, so he knew every peg of it. It is with gladness and pride that I look back upon those days. With gladness, because no discord was ever heard in the course of this fairly severe labor. With pride, because I was at the head of such a body of men. For men they were, in the true sense of the word. Everyone knew his duty and did it. During the night the wind dropped, and the morning brought the finest weather, calm and clear. It was a pleasure to work on days like this. Both men and dogs were in the best of spirits. On these journeys between the ship and the station we were constantly hunting seals, but we only took those that came in our way. We never had to go far to find fresh meat. We used to come suddenly upon a herd of them. They were then shot, flayed, and loaded on the sledges with the provisions and building materials. The dogs feasted in those days. They had as much warm flesh as they wanted. On January 20th we had taken up all the building materials, and could then turn our attention to provisions and stores. The work went merrily backwards and forwards, and the journey to the Fram in the morning with empty sledges was especially enjoyable. The track was now well worn and hard, and resembled a good Norwegian country road more than anything else. The going was splendid. On coming out of the tent at 6 o'clock in the morning, one was instantly greeted with joy by one's own 12 dogs. They barked and they howled in emulation, tugged and jerked at their chains to get their master, and jumped and danced about with joy. Then one would first go down the line and say good morning to each of them in turn, patting them and saying a few words. Splendid beasts they were. The one who had taken notice of showed every sign of happiness. The most petted of our domestic dogs could not have shown greater devotion than these tamed wolves. All the time the others were yelling and pulling at their chains to get at the one who was being petted, for they are jealous in the extreme. When they had all received their share of attention, the harnesses were brought out, and then the jubilation broke out afresh. Strange as it may seem, I can assert that these animals love their harness. Although they must know that it means hard work, they all show signs of the greatest rapture at the sight of it. I must hasten to add, however, that this only happens at home. Long and fatiguing sledge journeys show a very different state of things. When it came to harnessing, the first trouble of the day began. It was impossible to get them to stand still. The full meal of the previous evening, followed by the night's rest, had given them such a superabundance of energy and joy of life that nothing could make them stand still. They had to have a taste of the whip, yet it was a pity to start that. After having securely anchored the sledge, one was ready at last with one's team of 6 dogs harnessed. Now it might be thought that all was plain sailing, and that one had only to cast off one's moorings and be taken straight down to the ship. But that was far from being the case. Round about the camp a number of objects had collected in a short time, such as packing cases, building materials, empty sledges, and so on, and to steer clear of these was the great problem of the morning. The dog's greatest interest was, of course, concentrated upon these objects, and one had to be extremely lucky to avoid a spill. Let us follow one of these morning drives. The men are all ready and have their dogs well harnessed. 1, 2, 3, and we let them all go at once. We are off like the wind, and before one has time to swing the whip, one finds himself in the middle of a heap of building materials. The dogs have achieved the desire of their lives, to be able to make a thorough investigation of these materials in the way that is so characteristic of the dog and so incomprehensible to us. While this process is going on with the greatest enjoyment, the driver has got clear of the sledge and begins to disentangle the traces, which have wound themselves round planks and posts and whatever else may be laying handy. He is far from having achieved the desire of his life, to judge from the expression he uses. At last he is clear again. He looks round first and finds he is not the only one who has met with difficulties in the way. Over there among the cases he sees a performance going on which makes his heart leap with joy. One of the old hands has come to grief, and in so decisive a fashion that it will take him a long time to get clear again. With a triumphant smile he throws himself on the sledge and drives off. So long as he is on the barrier, as a rule, everything goes well. There is nothing here to distract the dogs. It is otherwise when he comes down to the sea ice. Here seals lie scattered about in groups basking in the sunshine, and it may easily happen that his course will be rather crooked. If a team of fresh dogs have made up their minds to turn aside in the direction of the herd of seals, it takes a very experienced driver to get them in the right way again. Personally, on such occasions, I use the only remedy I could see, namely capsizing the sledge. In loose snow, with the sledge upset, they soon fold up. Then, if one is wise, one puts them on the right course again quietly and calmly, hoisting the sledge up on an even keel, and went on. But one is not always wise, unfortunately. The desire to be revenged on the disobedient rascals gets the upper hand, and one begins to deal out punishment. But this is not so easy as it seems. So long as you are sitting on the capsized sledge, it makes a good anchor. But now, without a load, it is no use, and the dogs know that. So while you are thrashing one, the others start off, and the result is not always flattering to the driver. If he is lucky, he gets onto the capsized sledge again. But we have seen dogs and sledges arrive without drivers. All this trouble in the early morning sets the blood in active circulation, and one arrives at the ship drenched with perspiration, in spite of the temperature of -5 degrees Fahrenheit. But it sometimes happens that there is no interruption, and the drive is soon over. The dogs want no encouragement. They are willing enough. The 1.25 miles from the lower camp to the Fram is then covered in a few minutes. When we came out of the tent on the morning of January 21st, we were greatly surprised. We thought we must be mistaken, rubbed our eyes, opened them wider, but no, it was no good. The Fram was no longer to be seen. It had been blowing pretty strongly during the night with snow squalls. Presumably the weather had forced them to put out. We could also hear the roar of the sea dashing against the barrier. Meanwhile, we lost no time. The day before, Captain Nielsen and Christensen had shot 40 seals, and of all these we had brought in half the same day. Now we began to fetch in the rest. During the forenoon, while we were flaying and shooting seals, we heard the old well-known sound, the putt, putt, putt of the Fram's motor, and presently the crow's nest appeared above the barrier. But she did not get into her old berth before evening. A heavy swell had forced her to go outside. Meanwhile, the carpenters were busily constructing the hut. By January 21st, the roof was on, and the rest of the work could thus be done under cover. This was a great comfort to the men. At that time, their job was undoubtedly the worst of any. Bitterly cold it was for them, but I never heard them talk about it. When I came up to the tent after a day's work, one of them was busy cooking. The meal always consisted of pancakes and pitch-black strong coffee. How good it tasted! A rivalry soon arose between the two cook carpenters as to which of them could make the best pancakes. I think they were both clever at it. In the morning we had pancakes again, crisp, hot, delicate pancakes with the most glorious coffee, before I was even out of my sleeping bag. That is what the carpenters had to offer me at 5 o'clock in the morning. No wonder I enjoyed their society. Nor did the men in the lower camp suffer any privation. Wisting showed himself to be possessed of eminent talents as cook for the day. His special dish was penguins and skyew, gulls in cream sauce. It was served under the name of ptarmigan, of which it really reminded one. That Sunday we all went on board, with the exception of the necessary tent guards for both camps, and enjoyed life. We had worked hard enough that week. On Monday, January 23rd, we began to carry up the provisions. In order to save time, we had decided not to bring the provisions right up to the hut, but to store them, for the time being, on the elevation that lay on the other side, to the south of Mount Nelson. This spot was not more than 600 yards from the tent, but as the surface was rather rough here, we should save a good deal in the long run. Afterwards, when the Fram had sailed, we could take them the rest of the way. As it turned out, we never had time for this, so that our main store remained here. Sledging up to this point offered some difficulties at first. The dogs, who were accustomed to take the road to the lower camp between Nelson and Rönniken, could not understand why they might not do the same now. The journey with the empty sledges down to the ship was often particularly troublesome. From this point the dogs could hear their companions on the other side of Nelson in the lower camp, and then it appeared more than once that the dogs took command. If they once got in the humor for playing tricks of that sort, it was by no means easy to get them under control. We all of us had this experience without exception. Not one of us escaped this little extra turn. As the provisions came up, each driver took them off his sledge and laid the cases in the order which they should lie. We began by placing each sort by itself in small groups over the slope. This plan had the advantage that eventually would be easy to find. The load was usually 660 pounds, or 6 cases to each sledge. We had about 900 cases to bring up, and reckoned that we should have them all in place in the course of a week. Everything went remarkably well according to our reckoning. By noon on Saturday, January 28th, the hut was ready, and all the 900 cases were in place. The depot of provisions had quite an imposing appearance. Great rows of cases stood in the snow, all with their numbers outward, so that we could find what we wanted at once. And there was the house, all finished exactly as it had stood in its native place in Bungeford. But it would be difficult to imagine more different surroundings there. Green pine woods and splashing water, here ice, nothing but ice. Both scenes were beautiful. I stood thinking which I preferred. My thoughts traveled far, thousands of miles in a second. it was the forest that gained the day. As I had already mentioned, we had everything with us for fastening the hut down to the barrier, but the calm weather we had had all the time led us to suppose that the conditions would not be so bad as we had expected. We were therefore satisfied with the foundation dug in the barrier. The outside of the hut was tarred, and the roof covered with tarred paper, so that it was very visible against the white surroundings. That afternoon we broke up both camps and moved into our home, Framheim. What a snug, cozy, and cleanly impression it gave us when we entered the door. Bright new linoleum everywhere in the kitchen as well as our living room. We had good reason to be happy. Our other important point had been got over, and in much shorter time than I had ever hoped. Our path to the goal was opened up. We began to have a glimpse of the castle in the distance. The beauty is still sleeping, but the kiss is coming, the kiss that shall wake her. It was a happy party that assembled in the hut the first evening, and drank to the future to the music of the gramophone. All the full-grown dogs were now brought up here, and were fastened to wire ropes stretching in a square 50 yards on each side. It may be believed that they gave us some music. Collected as they were, they performed under the leadership of some great singer or other daily and, what was worse, nightly concerts. Strange beasts! What can they have meant by this howling? One began, then two, then a few more, and finally the whole 100. As a rule, during a concert like this, they sit well down, stretch their heads as high in the air as they can, and howl to their heart's content. During this act they seem very preoccupied, and are not easily disturbed. But the strangest thing is the way the concert comes to an end. It stops suddenly along the whole line. No stragglers, no one cheer more. What is it that imposes this simultaneous stop? I have observed and studied it time after time without result. One would think it was a song that had been learnt. Do the animals possess a power of communicating with each other? The question is extraordinarily interesting. No one among us who has had the long acquaintance with Eskimo dogs doubt that they have this power. I learned at last to understand their different sounds so well that I could tell by their voices what was going on without seeing them. Fighting, play, love-making, etc., each had its special sound. If they wanted to express their devotion and affection for their master, they would do it in a quite different way. If one of them was doing something wrong, something they knew that they were not allowed to do, such as breaking into the meat store, for example, the others who could not get in ran out and gave vent to a sound quite different from those I had mentioned. I believe most of us learn to distinguish these different sounds. They can hardly be a more interesting animal to observe, or one that offers greater variety of study than the Eskimo dog. From his ancestor the wolf he has inherited the instinct of self-preservation, the right of the stronger, in a far higher degree than our domestic dog. The struggle for life has brought him early maturity, and given him such qualities as frugality and endurance in an altogether surprising degree. His intelligence is sharp, clear, and well developed for the work he is born to, and the conditions in which he is brought up. We must not call the Eskimo dog slow to learn because he cannot sit up and take sugar when he is told. These are things so widely separated from the serious business of his life that he will never be able to understand them, or only with great difficulty. Among themselves, the right of the stronger is the only law. The strongest rules and does as he pleases undisputedly. Everything belongs to him. The weaker ones get the crumbs. Friendship easily springs up between the animals, always combined with respect and fear of the stronger. The weaker, with his instinct of self-preservation, seeks the protection of the stronger. The stronger accepts the position of protector and thereby secures a trusty helper, always with the thought of one stronger than himself. The instinct of self-preservation is to be found everywhere, and it is so, too, with their relations with man. The dog has learnt to value man as his benefactor, from whom he receives everything necessary for his support. Affection and devotion seem almost to have their part in these relations, but no doubt, on a closer examination, the instinct of self-preservation is at the root of it all. As a consequence of this, his respect for his master is far greater than our domestic dog, with whom respect only exists as a consequence of fear of a beating. I could without hesitation take the food out of the mouth of any one of my 12 dogs. Not one of them would attempt to bite me. And why? Because their respect, as a consequence of the fear of getting nothing next time, was predominant. With my dogs at home I certainly should not try the same thing. They would at once defend their food, and if necessary they would not shrink from using their teeth, and this in spite of the fact that these dogs have all appearance the same respect as the others. What then is the reason? Is it that this respect is not based on a serious foundation, the instinct of self-preservation, but simply on the fear of a hiding? A case like this proves that the foundation is too weak. The desire of food overcomes the fear of the stick, and the result is a snap. A few days later, the last member of the wintering party, Adolf Henrik Lindström, joined us, and with his arrival our arrangements might be regarded as complete. He stayed on board hitherto, attending to the cooking there, but now he is no longer necessary. His art would be more appreciated among the chatterers. The youngest member of the expedition, the cook Karinius Olsen, took over from that day the whole of the cooking on the Fram, and performed this work in an extremely conscientious and capable way until the ship reached Hobart in March of 1912, when he again had assistance. This was well done for a lad of 20. I wish we had many like him. With Lindström, then, the kitchen and the daily bread were in order. The smoke rose gaily from the shining black chimney and proclaimed that now the barrier was really inhabited. How cozy it was, when we came sledging up after a day's work, to see that smoke rising into the air. It is the little things, really, but nevertheless it means so much. With Lindström came not only food, but light and air, both of them his specialties. The Lux lamp was the first thing he rigged up, giving us a light that contributed much to the feeling of comfort and well-being through the long winter. He also provided us with air, but in this he had Stubberud as a partner. Those two together managed to give us the finest, purest barrier air in our room during the whole stay. It is true that this was not done without hard work, but they did not mind that. The ventilation was capricious and liable to fail now and then. This usually happened when there was a dead calm. Many were the ingenious devices employed by the firm to set the business going again. Generally a Primus stove was used under the exhaust pipe, and ice applied to the supply pipe. While one of them lay on his stomach, with the Primus under the exhaust, drawing up the air that way, the other ran up to the roof and dropped big lumps of snow down the supply to get the air in that way. In this fashion they could keep it going by the hour together without giving up. Finally ended in the ventilation becoming active again without visible cause. There is no doubt that the system of ventilation in a winter station like ours is of great importance, both to the health and comfort. I have read of expeditions, the members of which were constantly suffering from cold and damp and resulting sickness. This is nothing but a consequence of bad ventilation. If the supply of fresh air is sufficient, the fuel will be turned to better account, and the production of warmth will, of course, be greater. If the supply of air is insufficient, a great part of the fuel will be lost in an unconsumed state, and cold and damp will be the result. There must, of course, be a means of regulating the ventilation in accordance with requirements. We used only the Lux lamp in our hut, beside the stove in the kitchen, and with this we kept our room so warm that those of us in the upper berths were constantly complaining of the warmth. Originally there were places for 10 bunks in the room, but as there were only 9 of us, one of the bunks was removed and the space used for our chronometer locker. This contained 3 ordinary ship's chronometers. We had in addition 6 chronometer watches, which we wore continually, and which were compared throughout the whole winter. The meteorological instruments found a place in the kitchen, the only place we had for them. Lindström undertook the position of sub-director of the Framheim meteorological station and instrument maker to the expedition. Under the roof we stowed all of the things that would not stand severe frost, such as medicines, syrup, jam, cream, pickles, and sauces, besides all of our sledge boxes. A place was also made for the library under the roof. The week beginning on Monday, January 30th, was spent in bringing up coal, wood, oil, and our whole supply of dried fish. The temperature this summer varied between +5 degrees and -13 degrees Fahrenheit, a grand summer temperature. We also had shot many seals daily, and already had a great pile of about 100 of them lying just outside the door of the hut. One evening, as we were sitting at supper, Lindström came to tell us that we need not go down any more to the sea ice to shoot them, as they were coming to us. We went out and found he was right. Not far away, and making straight for the hut, came a crab-eater shining like silver in the sun. He came right up, was photographed, and shot. One day I had a rather curious experience. My best dog, Lassisen, had his left hind paw frozen quite white. It happened while we were out sledging. Lassisen was a lover of freedom, and had seen his chance of getting loose when unobserved. He used his freedom, like most of these dogs, for fighting. They love fighting and cannot resist it. He had picked a quarrel with Odin and Thor, and started a battle with them. In the course of the fight, the chains that fastened these two had got wound round Lassisen's leg, and twisted so that the circulation had stopped. How long he had been standing so, I do not know. But when I came, I saw at once that the dog was in the wrong place. On a closer examination, I discovered the frostbite. I then spent half an hour in restoring the circulation. I succeeded in doing this by holding the paw continuously in my warm hand. At first there was no feeling in the limb. It went well, but when the blood began to flow back, of course it was painful, and Lassisen became impatient. He whined and motioned with his head towards the affected place, as though he wanted to tell me that he found the operation unpleasant. He made no attempt to snap. The paw swelled a good deal after this treatment, but the next day Lassisen was as well as ever, though a little lame in that leg. The entries in my diary at this time are all in telegraphic style, no doubt owing to the amount of work. Thus, an entry in February ends with the following words: "An emperor penguin just came on a visit. Soup kettle." He did not give a very long epithet. During this week we relieved the sea party of the last of the dogs, about 20 puppies. There was rejoicing on board when the last of them left the deck, and indeed one could not be surprised. With the thermometer about -5 degrees Fahrenheit, as it had been lately, it was impossible to keep the deck clean, as everything froze at once. After they had all been brought onto the ice, the crew went to work with salt and water, and in a short time we recognized the Fram again. The puppies were put into boxes and driven up. We had put up a 16-man tent to receive them. From the very first moment they declined to stay in it, and there was nothing to be done but let them out. All these puppies passed a great part of the winter in the open air. So long as the seals' carcasses were lying on the slope, they stayed there. Afterwards they found another place. But the tent, despite the youngsters, came in to be useful after all. Any bitch that was going to have a litter was put in there, and the tent went by the name of the maternity hospital. Then one tent after another was put up, and Framheim looked quite an important place. 8 of the 16-man teams were set up for our 8 teams, 2 for dried fish, 1 for fresh meat, 1 for cases of provisions, and 1 for coal and wood, 14 altogether. They were arranged according to a plan drawn up beforehand, and when they were all up, they had quite the appearance of a camp. At this time our dog harness underwent important alterations, as one of the members of the expedition had an happy idea of combining the Alaska and the Greenland harness. This result satisfied all requirements. In the future we always used this construction, and we all agreed that it was much superior to any other harness. The dogs also seemed to be more comfortable in it. That they worked better and more easily is certain, and raw places so common with Greenland harness were absolutely unknown. February 4th was an eventful day. As usual, we all came down to the Fram, driving our empty sledges, at 6:30 in the morning. When the first man got to the top of the ridge, he began to wave his arms about and gesticulate like a madman. I understood, of course, that he saw something, but what? The next man gesticulated even worse and tried to shout to me, but it was no use. I could not make anything of it. Then it was my turn to go over the ridge, and, as was natural, I began to feel rather curious. I had only a few yards more to go, and then it was explained. Along the edge of the ice, just to the south of the Fram, a large barque lay moored. We had talked of the possibility of meeting the Terra, Captain Scott's vessel, when she was on her way to King Edward VII Land. But it was a great surprise all the same. Now it was my turn to wave my arms, and I am sure I did it no worse than the first two. And the same thing was repeated with all of us as soon as one reached the top of the ridge. What the last man did I have never been able to find out for certain, but no doubt he waved his arms too. If a stranger had stood and watched us that morning on the ridge, he would have surely have taken us for a lot of incurable lunatics. The way seemed long that day. But at last we got there and heard the full explanation. The Terra had come in at midnight. Our watchman had just gone below for a cup of coffee. There was no harm in that. And when he came up again, there was another ship lying off the foot of the barrier. He rubbed his eyes, pinched his leg, and tried other means of convincing himself that he was asleep. But it was no good. The pinch especially, he told us afterwards, was horribly painful. And all this led to the conclusion that there really was a second vessel there. Lieutenant Campbell, the leader of the eastern party, which was to explore King Edward VII Land, came on board first and paid Nilsen a visit. He brought the news that they had not been able to reach land and were now on their way back to McMurdo Sound. From thence it was their intentions to go to Cape North and explore the land there. Immediately after my arrival, Lieutenant Campbell came on board again and gave me the news himself. We then loaded our sledges and drove home. At 9 o'clock we had the great pleasure of receiving Lieutenant Purnell, the commander of the Terra Nova, Lieutenant Campbell, and the surgeon of the expedition as the first guests in our new home. We spent a couple of very agreeable hours together. Later in the day 3 of us paid a visit to the Terra Nova and stayed on board to lunch. Our hosts were extremely kind, and offered to take our mail to New Zealand. If I had had time, I should have been glad to avail myself of this friendly offer, but every hour was precious. It was no use to think of writing now. At 2 o'clock in the afternoon the Terra Nova cast off again and left the Bay of Whales. We made a strange discovery after this visit. Nearly all of us had caught cold. It did not last long, only a few hours, and then it was over. The form it took was sneezing and cold in the head. The next day, Sunday, February 5th, the Sea Rovers, as we called the Fram party, were our guests. We had to have them in 2 detachments, as they could not all leave the ship at the same time. 4 came to dinner and 6 to supper. We had not much to offer, but we invited them not so much for the sake of entertainment as to show them our new home and wish them a successful voyage. End of Section 12. End of Volume 1, Chapter 5, On the Barrier. Recorded by Ken Campbell.
The South Pole. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Jamie Strassenberg. The South Pole by Roald Amundsen. Translation by A.G. Carter. Section 13, Volume 1, Chapter 6, Depot Journeys, Part 1. There was now too little work for 8 of us in bringing up stores from the Fram, and it became evident that some of us might be more usefully employed elsewhere. It was therefore decided that 4 men should bring ashore the little that remained, while the other 4 went southward to latitude 80° south, partly to explore the immediate neighborhood and partly to begin the transport of provisions to the south. This arrangement gave us all enough to do. The 4 who were to continue the work at the station, Wisting, Hassel, Stubberud, and Bjaland, now had as much as their sledges could carry. The rest of us were busy getting ready. For that matter, everything was prepared in advance, but as yet we had had no experience of a long journey. That was what we were going to get now. Our departure was fixed for Friday, February 10th. On the 9th I went on board to say good-bye, as presumably the Fram would have sailed when we came back. I had so much to thank all these plucky fellows for. I know it was hard for them, almost without exception, to have to leave us now, at the most interesting time, and to go out to sea to battle for months with cold and darkness, ice and storms, and then have the same voyage over again the next year, when they had to come and fetch us. It was certainly a hard task, but none of them complained. They had all promised to do their best to promote our common object, and therefore all went about their duty without grumbling. I left written orders with the commander of the Fram, Captain Nilsen. The substance of these orders may be given in a few words. carry out our plan in the best way you may think. I knew the man I was giving orders to. A more capable and honorable second in command I could never have had. I knew the Fram was safe in his hands. Lieutenant Prestrud and I made a trip to the south to find a suitable place for ascending the barrier on the other side of the bay. The sea ice was fairly even for this distance, only a few cracks here and there. Farther up the bay there were, curiously enough, long rows of old hummocks. What could this mean? This part was really quite protected from the sea, so that these formations could not be attributed to its action. We hoped to have an opportunity of investigating the conditions more closely later on. There was no time for it now. The shortest and most direct way to the south was the one we were on now. The bay was not wide here. The distance from the Framheim to this part of the barrier was about 3 miles. The ascent of the barrier was not difficult. With the exception of a few fissures, it was quite easy. It did not take long to get up, except perhaps in the steepest part. The height was 60 feet. It was quite exciting to go up. What should we see at the top? We had never yet had a real interrupted view over the barrier to the south. This was the first time. As it happened, we were not surprised at what we saw when we got up. An endless plain that was lost in the horizon on the extreme south. Our course, we could see, would take us just up along the side of the ridge before mentioned, a capital mark for later journeys. The going was excellent. A thin layer of conveniently loose snow was spread over a hard undersurface, and it made it very suitable for skiing. The lie of the ground told us at once that we had the right pattern of ski, the kind for level ground, long and narrow. We had found what we wanted, an ascent for our southern journeys and an open road. This spot was afterwards marked with a flag, and went by the name of the starting place. On the way back, as on the way out, we passed large herds of seals, lying asleep. They did not take the least notice of us. If we went up and woke them, they raised their heads a little, looked at us for a moment, and then rolled over on the other side and went to sleep again. It was very evident that these animals here on the ice have no enemies. They certainly would have set a watch, as their brothers in the north do, if they had anything to fear. On this day we used skin clothing for the first time, reindeer skin clothes of Eskimo cut, but they proved to be too warm. We had the same experience later. In low temperatures these reindeer clothes are beyond comparison the best, but here in the south we did not as a rule have low temperatures on our sledge journeys. On the few occasions when we experienced any cold worth talking about, we were always in skins. We returned in the evening after our reconnoitring. We had no need of a Turkish bath. On February 10th at 9:30 a.m. the first expedition left for the south. We were 4 men, with 3 sledges and 18 dogs, 6 for each sledge. The load amounted to about 550 pounds of provisions per sledge, besides the provisions and outfit for the journey. We could not tell, even approximately, how long the journey would take, as everything was unknown. The chief thing we took on our sledges was the dog's pemmican for the depot, 350 pounds per sledge. We also took a quantity of seal meat cut into steaks, blubber, dried fish, chocolate, margarine, and biscuits. We had 10 long bamboo poles, with black flags, to mark the way. The rest of our outfit consisted of 2 3-man tents, 4 1-man sleeping bags, and the necessary cooking utensils. The dogs were very willing, and we left Framheim at full gallop. Along the barrier we went well. Going down to the sea ice we had to pass through a number of big hummocks, a fairly rough surface. Nor was this without consequences. First one sledge, then another, swung round, but no harm was done. We got our gear tested, and that is always an advantage. We also had to pass rather near several large groups of seals, and the temptation was too great. Away went the dogs to one side in full gallop towards the seals, but the load this time was heavy, and they were too soon tired of the extra work. In the bay we were in sight of the Fram. The ice had now given way entirely, so that she lay close to the barrier herself. Our 4 comrades, who were to stay at home, accompanied us. In the first place, they wanted to see us on our way, and in the second, they would be able to lend us a hand in getting up the barrier, for we were rather apprehensive that it would cost us a wet shirt. Finally, they were to hunt seals. There was plenty of opportunity here. Wherever one looked there were seals, fat, heavy beasts. I had put the home party under Wisting's command and given them enough work to do. They were to bring up the remainder of the stores from the ship, and to build a large, roomy penthouse against the western wall of the hut, so that we should not have to go directly on the ice from the kitchen. We also intended to use this as a carpenter's workshop. But they were not to forget the seal hunting, early and late. It was important to us to get the seals enough to enable us all, men and dogs, to live in plenty, and there were enough to be had. If we ran short of fresh meat in the course of winter, it would be entirely our own fault. It was a good thing we had help for the climb. Short as it was, it caused us a good deal of trouble, for we had dogs enough, and by harnessing a sufficient number we got the sledges up. I should like to know what they thought on board. They could see we were already hard to put it to get up there. What would it be like when we had to get on the plateau? I did not know whether they thought of the old saying, "Practice makes perfect." We halted at the starting place, where we were to separate from our comrades. None of us was particularly sentimental. An honest shake of the hand, and so, good-bye. The order of our march was as follows. Prestrud on the first ski, to show the direction and encourage the dogs. We always went better with someone going in front. Next came Helmer Hansen. We kept this place on all our journeys, the leading sledge. I knew him well from our previous work together, and regarded him as the most efficient dog driver I had met. He carried the standard compass on his sledge, and checked Prestrud's direction. After him came Johansen, also with a compass. Lastly, I came, with a sledge meter and compass. I preferred to take the last sledge because it enabled me to see what was happening. However careful one may be, it is impossible to avoid dropping things from sledges in making a journey. If the last man keeps a lookout for such things, great inconveniences may often be avoided. I could mention many rather important things that were dropped in the course of our journeys, and picked up again by the last man. The hardest work, of course, falls on the first man. He has to open up the road and drive his dogs forward, while we others only have to follow. All honor, then, to the man who performed this task from the first day to the last, Helmer Hansen. The position of forerunner is not a very enviable one either. Of course he escapes all bother with dogs, but it is confoundedly tedious to walk there alone, staring at nothing. His only diversion is a shout from the leading sledge, a little to the right, a little to the left. It is not so much the simple words that divert him as the tone in which they are called. Now and then the cry comes in a way that makes him feel he is acquitting himself well, but sometimes it sends a cold shiver down his back. The speaker might just as well have added the word "duffer." There is no mistaking his tone. It is no easy matter to go straight on a surface without landmarks. Imagine an immense plain that you have to cross in thick fog. It is dead calm, and the snow lies evenly, without drifts. What would you do? An Eskimo can manage it, but none of us. We should turn to the right or to the left, and give the leading dog driver, with the standard compass, endless trouble. It is strange how this affects the mind. Although the man with the compass knows quite well that the man in front cannot do any better, and although he knows that he could not do better himself, he nevertheless gets irritated in time, and works himself into the belief that the unsuspecting, perfectly innocent leader only takes these turns to annoy him. And so, as I have said, the words "a little to the left" imply the unspoken addition, perfectly understood on both sides, "duffer." I have personal experience on both duties. With the dog driver time passes far more quickly. He has his dogs to look after, and he has to see that all are working and none shirking. Many other points about a team claim his attention, and he must always keep an eye on the sledge itself. If he does not do this, some slight unevenness may throw the runners in the air before he knows where he is, and to ride a capsized sledge, weighing about 800 weight, is no fun. Instead of running this risk, he gives his whole attention to what is before him. From the starting place the barrier rises very slightly, until at a cross ridge it passes into the perfect level. Here on the ridge we halt once more. Our comrades have disappeared and gone to their work, but in the distance the Fram lies, framed in shining blue-white ice. We are but human. Uncertainty always limits our prospect. Shall we meet again? And if so, under what conditions? Much lay between that moment and the next time we should see her. The mighty ocean on one side, and the unknown region of ice on the other. So many things might happen. Her flag floats out, waves us a last adieu, and disappears. We are on our way to the south. This first inland trip to the barrier was undeniably exciting. The ground was absolutely unknown, and our outfit untried. What kind of country should we have to deal with? Would it continue in this boundless plain without hindrance of any kind, or would nature present insurmountable difficulties? We were right in supposing that dogs were the best means of transport in these regions, or should we have done better to take reindeer, ponies, motor cars, aeroplanes, or anything else? We went forward at a rattling pace. The going was perfect. The dogs' feet trod on the thin layer of loose snow, just enough to give them a secure hold. The weather conditions were not quite what we should have wished in an unknown country. It is true that it was calm and mild, and altogether pleasant for travelling, but the light was not good. A grey haze, the most unpleasant of kind after fog, lay upon the landscape, making the barrier and sky merge into one. There was no horizon to be seen. This grey haze, presumably a younger sister of fog, is extremely disagreeable. One can never be certain of one's surroundings. There are no shadows, everything looks the same. In a light like this, it is a bad thing to be the forerunner. He does not see the inequalities of the ground until too late, until he is right on them. This often ends in a fall, or in desperate efforts to keep on his feet. It is better for the drivers. They can steady themselves with a hand on the sledge, but they also have to be on the lookout for inequalities and see that the sledges do not capsize. This light is also very trying to the eyes, and one often hears of snow blindness after such a day. The cause of this is not only that one strains one's eyes continually, it is also brought by carelessness. One is very apt to push one's snow goggles up onto one's head, especially if they are fitted with dark glasses. However, we always come through it very well. Only a few of us had a little touch of this unpleasant complaint. Curiously enough, snow blindness has something in common with seasickness. If you ask a man whether he is seasick, in 9 cases out of 10 he will answer, "No, not at all, only a little queer in the stomach." It is the same, in a slightly different way, with snow blindness. If a man comes into the tent in the evening with an inflamed eye and you ask him whether he is snow blind, you may be sure he is almost offended. Snow blind? Is it likely? No, not at all, only a little queer about the eye. We did 17 miles that day without exertion. We had 2 tents, and slept 2 in a tent. These tents were made for 3 men, but were too small for 4. Cooking was only done in one, both for the sake of economy, so that we might leave more at the depot, and because it was unnecessary, as the weather was still quite mild. On this first trip, as on all the depot journeys, our morning arrangements took far too long. We began to get ready at 4, but were not on the road until nearly 8. I was always trying some means of remedying this, but without success. It will naturally be asked what could be the cause of this, and I will answer candidly, it was dawdling and nothing else. On these depot journeys it did not matter so much, but on the main journey we had to banish dawdling relentlessly. Next day we did the allotted 17 miles in 6 hours, and pitched our camp early in the afternoon. The dogs were rather tired, as it had been uphill work all day. Today, from a distance of 28 miles, we could look down into the Bay of Whales. This shows that we had ascended considerably. We estimated our camp that evening to be 500 feet above the sea. We were astonished at this rise, but ought not to have been so really, since we had already estimated this ridge at 500 feet when we first saw it from the end of the bay. But however it may be, most of us have a strong propensity for setting up theories and inventing something new. What others have seen does not interest us, and on this occasion we took the opportunity, I say we, because I was one of them, of propounding a new theory, that of an evenly advancing ice slope from the Antarctic plateau. We saw ourselves in our mind's eye ascending gradually to the top, and thus avoiding a steep and laborious climb among the mountains. The day had been very warm. positive 12.2 degrees Fahrenheit, and I had been obliged to throw off everything except the most necessary underclothes. My costume may be guessed from the name I gave to the ascent, Singlet Hill. There was a thick fog when we turned out the next morning, exceedingly unpleasant. Here every inch was over virgin ground, and we had to do it blindly. That day we had a feeling of going downhill. At 1 o'clock land was reported right ahead. From the gesticulations of those in front I made out that it must be uncommonly big. I saw absolutely nothing, but that was not very surprising. My sight is not especially good, and the land did not exist. The fog lifted, and the surface looked a little broken. The imaginary land lasted till the next day, when we found out that it had only been a descending bank of fog. That day we put on the pace, and did 25 miles instead of our usual 17. We were very lightly clad. There could be no question of skins. They were laid aside at once. Very light wind clothing was all we wore over our underclothes. On this journey most of us slept bare-legged in the sleeping bags. Next day we were surprised by brilliantly clear weather and a dead calm. For the first time we had a good view. Towards the south the barrier seemed to continue, smooth and even, without ascending. Towards the east, on the other hand, there was a marked rise, presumably towards King Edward VII. Land, we thought then. In the course of the afternoon we passed the first fissure we had met with. It had apparently been filled up long ago. Our distance that day was 23 miles. On these depot journeys we were always very glad of our thermos flasks. In the middle of the day we made a halt, and took a cup of scalding hot chocolate, and it was very pleasant to be able to get one without any trouble in the middle of the snow plateau. On the final southern journey we did not take thermos flasks. We had no lunch then. On February 14th, after a march of 11½ miles, we reached 80 degrees south. Unfortunately, we did not exceed in getting any astronomical observation on this trip, as the theodolite we had brought up with us went wrong, but later observations on several occasions gave 79 degrees. We had not so bad in fog. We marked out the route up to this point with bamboo poles and flags every 15 kilometers. Now, as we had not fixed the position by any astronomical observation, we found that the flags would not be sufficient, and we had to look for some other means of marking the spot. A few empty cases were broken up and gave certain number of masks, but not nearly enough. Then our eyes fell upon a bundle of dried fish lying on one edge of the sledges, and our marking pegs were found. I should like to know whether any road has been marked out with dried fish before. I doubt it. Immediately on our first arrival in latitude 80 degrees, at 11 in the morning, we began to erect the depot. It was made quite solid, and was 12 feet high. The going here in 80 degrees was quite different from what we had seen in all the rest of the way. Deep, loose snow everywhere gave us the impression that it must have fallen in perfectly still weather. Generally, when we passed by there, but not always, we found some loose snow. When the depot was finished, and had been photographed, we threw ourselves on the sledges and began the homeward journey. It was quite a treat to sit and be drawn along, a thing that otherwise never happened. Prestrud sat with me. Hansen drove first, but as he had now had the old track to follow, he wanted no one in front. On the last sledge we had the marking pegs. Prestrud kept an eye on the sledge meter, and sang out at every half kilometer, while at the same time I stuck a dried fish into the snow. This method of marking the route proved a brilliant one. Not only did the dried fish show us the right way on several occasions, but they also came in very useful on the next journey, which when we returned was starving dogs. That day we covered 43 miles. We did not get to bed till 1 o'clock at night, but this did not prevent our being up again at 4 and off at 7:30. At 9:30 in the evening we drove into Framheim, after covering 62 miles that day. Our reason for driving that distance was not to set up any record for the barrier, but to get home, if possible, before the Fram sailed, and thus have an opportunity of once more shaking hands with our comrades and wishing them a good voyage. But as we came over the edge of the barrier, we saw that, in spite of all our pains, we had come too late. The Fram was not there. It gave us a strange and melancholy feeling, not easy to understand. but the next moment common sense returned, and our joy at her having got away from the barrier undamaged after the long stay was soon uppermost. We heard that she had left the bay at noon the same day, just as we were spurting our hardest to reach her. This depot journey was quite sufficient to tell us what the future had in store. After this we were justified in seeing in it a rosy light. We now had experience of 3 important factors: the lie of the ground, the going, and the means of traction, and the result was that nothing could be better. Everything was in the most perfect order. I had always had a high opinion of dog as a draught animal, but after this last performance my admiration of these splendid animals rose to the pitch of enthusiasm. Let us look at what my dogs accomplished on this occasion. On February 14th they went 11 miles southward with a load of 770 pounds, and on the same day 32 miles northward. Only 4 of them, the 3 musketeers and Lassesen, as Fix and Sneppeson, refused to do any work. The weight they started with being from 80 degrees south was that of the sledge, 165 pounds, Prestrud 176 pounds, and myself 182 pounds. Add to this 154 pounds for sleeping bags, ski, and dried fish, and we have a total weight of 677 pounds, or about 170 pounds per dog. The last day they did 62 miles. I think the dogs showed on this occasion that they were well suited for sledging on the barrier. In addition to this brilliant result, we arrived at several other conclusions. In the first place, the question of the long time spent in our morning preparations thrust itself on our notice. This could not be allowed to occur on the main journey. At least 2 hours might be saved, I had no doubt of that. But how? I should have to take time to think it over. What required most alteration was our heavy outfit. The sledges were constructed with a view to the most difficult conditions of ground. The surface here was of the easiest kind, and consequently permitted the use of the lightest outfit. We ought to be able to reduce the weight of the sledges by at least half, possibly more. Our big canvas ski boots were found to need thorough alteration. They were too small and too stiff, and had to be made larger and softer. Footgear had such an important bearing on the success of the whole expedition that we had to do all that it could to be done to get right. The 4 who had stayed at home had accomplished a fine piece of work. Framheim was hardly recognizable with the big new addition on its western wall. This penthouse was of the same width as the hut, 13 feet, and measured about 10 feet the other way. Windows had been put in, 2 of them, and it looked quite bright and pleasant when one came in, but this was not to last for long. Our architects had also dug a passage 5 feet wide round the whole hut, and this was now covered over, simply by prolonging the sloping roof down to the snow to form a roof over this passage. On the side facing east a plank was fixed across the gable at the required height, and from this boards were brought down into the snow. The lower part of this new extension of the roof was well strengthened, and the weight of snow that would probably accumulate upon it in the course of the winter should be very great. This passage was connected with the penthouse by a side door in the northern wall. The passage was constructed to serve as a place for strong tinned foods and fresh meat, besides which its eastern end afforded an excellent place to get snow for melting. Here Lindström could be sure of getting as much clean snow as he wanted, which was an impossibility outside the house. We had 120 dogs running about, and they were not particular as to the purpose for which we might want the snow. But here in this snow wall Lindström had no need to fear the dogs. Another great advantage was that he would not have to go out in bad weather, darkness, and cold, and every time he wanted a piece of ice. We now had to turn our attention, in the first place, before the cold weather set in, to the arrangement of our dog tents. We could not leave them standing as they were on the snow. If we did so, we should soon find that the dogs' teeth are just as sharp as knives. Besides which, they would be draughty and cold for the animals. To counteract this, the floor of each tent was sunk 6 feet below the surface of the barrier. A great part of the excavation had to be done with the axes, as we soon came to the bare ice. One of these dog tents, when finished, had quite an important appearance when one stood at the bottom and looked up. It measured 18 feet from the floor to the peak of the tent, and the diameter of the floor was 15 feet. Then 12 posts were driven into the ice floor at equal intervals round the wall of the tent, and the dogs were tethered to them. From the very first day the dogs took a liking to their quarters, and they were right, as they were well off there. I do not remember once seeing frost rime on the coats of my dogs down in the tent. They enjoyed every advantage there: air without draughts, light, and sufficient room. Round the tent pole we left a pillar of snow standing in the middle of the tent to the height of a man. It took us 2 days to put our 8 dog tents in order. Before the Fram sailed one of the whale boats had been put ashore on the barrier. One never knew. If we found ourselves in want of a boat, it would be bad to have none, and if we did not have to use it, there was no great harm done. It was brought up on 2 sledges drawn by 12 dogs, and it was taken some distance unto the barrier. The mast stood high in the air, and showed us its position clearly. Besides all their other work, the 4 men had found time shooting seals while we were away, and large quantities of meat were now stowed everywhere. We had to lose no time in getting ready the tent in which we stored our chief supply of seal meat. It would not have lasted long if we had left it unprotected on the ground. To keep off the dogs, we built a 7 feet high wall of large blocks of snow. The dogs themselves saw to its covering with ice, and for the time being all possibility of their reaching the meat was removed. We did not let the floor grow old under our feet. It was time to be off again to the south with more food. Our departure was fixed for February 22nd, and before that time we had a great deal to do. All the provisions had first to be brought from the main depot and prepared for the journey. Then we had to open the cases of pemmican, take out the boxes in which it was soldered, 4 rations in each, cut these open, and put these 4 rations back in the case without the tin lining. By doing this we saved so much weight, and at the same time avoided the trouble of having to do this work later in the cold. The tin packing was used for the passage through the tropics, where I was afraid the pemmican might possibly melt and run into the hold of the ship. This opening and repacking took a long time, but we got through it. We used the penthouse as a packing shed. Another thing that took up a great deal of our time was our personal outfit. The question of boots was gone into thoroughly. Most of us were in favor of the other big outer boots, but in a revised edition. There were a few, but extremely few, who declared for nothing but soft footgear. In this case it did not make so much difference, since they all knew that the big boots would have to be brought on the final journey on account of possible work on glaciers. Those, therefore, who wanted to wear soft footgear and hang their boots on the sledge might do so if they liked. I did not want to force anyone to wear boots he did not care for. It might lead to much unpleasantness and responsibility. Everyone, therefore, might do as much as he pleased. Personally, I was in favor of boots with stiff soles, so long as the uppers could be made soft and sufficiently large to give room for as many stockings as one wished to wear. It was a good thing the bootmaker could not look in upon us at Framheim just then, and many times afterwards, for that matter. The knife was mercilessly applied to his beautiful work, and the canvas, plus a quantity of the superfluous leather, was cut away. As I had no great knowledge of the shoemaker's craft, I gladly accepted Wisting's offer to operate on mine. The boots were unrecognizable when I got them back from him. As regards shape, they were perhaps just as smart before the alteration, but as this is a very unimportant matter in comparison with ease and comfort, I considered them improved by many degrees. The thick canvas was torn off and replaced by thin, weatherproof fabric. Big wedges were inserted in the toes, and allowed room for several more pairs of stockings. Besides this, one of the many soles was removed, thus increasing the available space. It appeared to me now that I had footgear that combined all the qualities I demanded: stiff soles, on which the Huitfeldt, Hoyer, Elfenstein steel buildings could be used, and otherwise soft, so that the foot was not pinched anywhere. In spite of all these alterations, my boots were once more in the hands of the operator before the main journey, but when they were made perfect. The boots of all the others underwent the same transformation, and every day our outfit became more complete. A minor number of alterations in our wardrobe were also carried out. One man was an enthusiast for blinkers on his cap, another did not care for them. One put on a nose protector, and another took his off, and if there was a question of which was right, each was prepared to defend his idea to the last. These were all alterations of minor importance, but being due to individual judgment, they helped to raise the spirits and increase self-confidence. Patents for braces also became the fashion. I invented one myself, and was very proud of it for a time. Indeed, I had the satisfaction of seeing it adopted by one of my rivals, but that rarely happened. Each of us wanted to make his own inventions, and to be as original as possible. Any contrivance that resembled something already in use was no good. But we found, like the farmer, that the old way often turned out to be the best. By the evening of February 21st, we were again ready to start. The sledges, 7 in number, stood ready packed, and were quite imposing in appearance. Tempted by the favorable outcome of our former trip, we put too much on our sledges this time. On some of them, in any case, mine was overloaded. I had to suffer it afterwards, or, rather, my noble animals did. On February 22nd at 8:30 a.m. the caravan moved off, 8 men, 7 sledges, and 42 dogs, and the most toilsome part of our whole expedition began. As usual, we began well from Framheim. Lindström, who was to stay at home alone and look after things, did not stand and wave farewells to us. Beaming with joy, he made for the hut as soon as the last sledge was in motion. He was visibly relieved, but I knew very well that before long he would begin to take little turns outside to watch the ridge. Would they soon be coming? There was a light breeze from the south, dead against us, and the sky was overcast. Newly fallen snow made the going heavy, and the dogs had to work hard for their loads. Our former tracks were no longer visible, but we were lucky enough to find the first flag, which stood 11 miles inland. From there we followed the dried fish, which stood out sharply against the white snow, and which were very easy to see. We pitched our camp at 6 o'clock in the evening, having come a distance of 17 miles. Our camp was quite imposing, 4 tents for 3 men apiece, with 2 in each. In 2 of them the housekeeping arrangements were carried on. The weather had improved during the afternoon, and by evening we had the most brilliant clear sky. Next day the going was even heavier, and the dogs were severely tired. We did no more than 12½ miles after 8 hours' march. The temperature remained reasonable, positive 5 degrees Fahrenheit. We had lost our dried fish, and for the last few hours we were going only by compass. End of section 13. Recording by Jamie Strassenberg, Cypress, California.
Of the South Pole. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Lizzie Driver. The South Pole by Roald Amundsen. Translation by A. G. Carter. Section 14, Volume 1, Chapter 6. Depot Journeys, Part 2. February 24th began badly. A strong wind from the southeast, with thick driving snow. We could see nothing, and had to steer our course by compass. It was bitter going against the wind, although the temperature was no worse than –0.4 degrees Fahrenheit. We went all day without seeing any mark. The snow stopped falling about noon, and at 3 o'clock it cleared. As we were looking about for a place to pitch the tents, we caught sight of one of our flags. When we reached it we found it was flag number 5. All our bamboos were numbered, so we knew the exact position of the flag number 5 was 44½ miles from Framheim. This agreed with the distance recorded, 44 miles. The next day was calm and clear, and the temperature began to descend, –13 degrees Fahrenheit. But in spite of this lower temperature, the air felt considerably milder, as it was quite still. We followed marks and fished the whole way, and at the end of our day's journey we had covered 18 miles, a good distance for heavy going. We then had a couple of days of bitter cold with fog, so that we did not see much of our surroundings. We followed the fish and the marks most of the way. We had already begun to find the fish useful as extra food. The dogs took it greedily. The forerunner had to take up each fish and throw it on one side. Then one of the drivers went out, took it up, and put it on his sledge. If the dogs had come upon the fish standing in the snow, we should have soon had fierce fights. Even now, before we reached the depot in 80° south, the dogs began to show signs of exhaustion, probably as a result of the cold weather (-16.6° Fahrenheit) and the hard work. They were stiff in the legs in the morning and difficult to set going. On February 27 at 10:30 a.m. we reached the depot in 80° south. The depot was standing as we had left it, and no snowdrifts had formed about it, from which we concluded that the weather conditions had been quiet. The snow, which we had found very loose when we were there before, was now hardened by the cold. We were lucky with the sun, and got the position of the depot accurately determined. On our way across these endless plains, where no landmarks of any kind are to be found, we had repeatedly thought of a means of making our depots so that we might be perfectly sure of finding them again. Our fight for the Pole was entirely dependent on this autumn work, in laying down large supplies of provisions as far to the south as possible, in such a way that we could be certain of finding them again. If we missed them, the battle would probably be lost. As I have said, we had discussed the question thoroughly, and came to the conclusion that we should have to try to mark our depots at right angles to the route, in an east and west direction, instead of a line with the route north and south. These marks along the line of the route may easily be missed in fog, if they are not close enough together, and if one thus gets out of the line, there is a danger of not picking it up again. According to this new arrangement, we therefore marked this depot in 80° south, with high bamboo poles carrying black flags. We used 20 of these, 10 on each side of the depot. Between each two flags there was a distance of 984 yards (900 metres), so that the distance marked on each side of the depot was 5½ miles (9 kilometres). Each bamboo was marked with a number, so that we should always be able to tell from this number on which side the depot lay and how far off. This method was entirely new and untried, but proved afterwards to work with absolute certainty. Our compasses and sledge meters had, of course, been carefully adjusted at the station, and we knew that we could rely on them. Having put this in order, we continued our journey on the following day. The temperature fell steadily as we went inland. If it continued in this way it would be cold before one got to the Pole. The surface remained as before, flat and even. We ourselves had a feeling that we were ascending, but, as the future will show, this was only imagination. We had had no troubles with fissures, and it almost looked as if we should avoid them altogether, since, of course, it might be supposed that the part of the Barrier nearest the edge would be the most fissured, and we had already left that behind us. South of 80° we found the going easier, but the dogs were now beginning to be stiff and sore-footed, and it was hard work to get them started in the morning. The sore feet I am speaking of here are not nearly so bad as those the dogs are liable to on the sea ice of the Arctic regions. What caused sore feet on this journey was the stretches of snow crust we had to cross. It was not strong enough to bear the dogs, and they broke through and cut their paws. Sore feet were also caused by the snow caking and sticking between the toes. But the dog that has to travel on sea ice in spring and summer is exposed to worse things. The sharp ice cuts the paws and the salt gets in. To prevent this kind of sore feet one is almost obliged to put socks on the dogs. With the kind of foot trouble our dogs experienced, it is not necessary to take any such precautions. As a result of the long sea voyage, their feet had become unusually tender and could not stand much. On our spring journey we noticed no sore-footedness, in spite of the conditions being worse rather than better. Probably their feet had got into condition in the course of the winter. On March 3 we reached 81° south. The temperature was then -45.4° Fahrenheit, and it did not feel pleasant. The change had come too rapidly. This could be seen in both men and dogs. We pitched our camp at 3 in the afternoon and went straight into the tents. The following day was employed in building and marking the depot. That night was the coldest we observed on the trip, as the temperature was –49° Fahrenheit when we turned out in the morning. If one compares the conditions of temperature in the Arctic and Antarctic regions, it will be seen that this temperature is an exceptionally low one. The beginning of March corresponds, of course, to the beginning of September in the Northern Hemisphere, a time of year when summer still prevails. We were astonished to find this low temperature while summer ought still to have lasted, especially when I remembered the moderate temperatures Shackleton had observed on his southern sledge journey. The idea at once occurred to me of the existence of a local pole of maximum cold extending over the central portion of the Ross Barrier. A comparison with the observations recorded at Captain Scott's station in McMurdo Sound might to some extent explain this. In order to establish it completely, one would require to have information about the conditions in King Edward Land as well. The observations Dr. Mawson is now engaged upon in Adélie Land and on the Barrier farther west will contribute much to the elucidation of this question. In 81° S. we laid down a depot, consisting of 14 cases of dogs' pemmican, 1,234 lbs. For marking this depot we had no bamboo poles, so there was nothing to be done but to break up some cases and use the pieces as marks. This was, at any rate, better than nothing. Personally, I considered these pieces of wood, 2 feet high, good enough, considering the amount of precipitation I had remarked since our arrival in these regions. The precipitation we had observed was very slight, considering the time of year, spring and summer. If, then, the snowfall was so inconsiderable at this time of the year and along the edge of the Barrier, what might it not be in autumn and winter in the interior? As I have said, something was better than nothing, and Bjaaland, Hassel, and Stubbard, who were to return to Lindström's flesh pots on the following day, were given up the task of setting up these marks. As with the former depot, this one was marked for 9 kilometres on each side from east to west, so that we might know where the depot was in case we should come upon one of these marks in a fog. All those on the east were marked with a little cut of an axe. I must confess they looked insignificant, these little bits of wood that were soon lost to sight on the boundless plain, and the idea that they held the key of the castle where the fair one slept made me smile. They looked altogether too inconsiderable for such an honour. Meanwhile, we others, who were to go on to the south, took it easy. The rest was good for the dogs especially, that the cold prevented their enjoying it as they should have done. At 8 o'clock next morning we parted company with the 3 who went north. I had to send home one of my dogs, Odin, who had got an ugly raw paw. I was using Greenland harness on him, and I went on with 5 dogs. These were very thin and apparently worn out, but in any case we had to reach 82° S before we gave up. I had had some hope that we might have got to 83°, but it began to look as if we had a poor chance of that. After 81° S, the Barrier began to take on a slightly different appearance. Instead of the absolutely flat surface, we saw on the first day a good many small formations of the shape of haycocks. At that time we did not pay much attention to these apparently insignificant irregularities, but later on we learned to keep our eyes open and our feet active when passing in their vicinity. On this first day southward from 81° S we noticed nothing. The going was excellent, the temperature not so bad as it had been, –27.4° Fahrenheit, and the distance covered very creditable. The next day we got our first idea of the meaning of these little mounds, as the surface was cut up by crevasse after crevasse. These fissures were not particularly wide, but were bottomless as far as we could see. About noon Hanssen's 3 leading dogs, Helg, Mylius, and Ring, fell into one of them, and remained hanging by their harnesses, and it was lucky the traces held, as the loss of these 3 would have been severely felt. When the rest of the team saw these 3 disappear, they stopped short. Fortunately they had a pronounced fear of these fissures, and always stopped when anything happened. We understood now that the haycock formations were the result of pressure, and that crevasses were always found in their neighbourhood. That day was, for the most part, thick and hazy, with a northerly wind and snow showers from time to time. Between the showers we caught sight of lofty, very lofty, pressure ridges, 3 or 4 of them to the eastward. We estimated their distance at about 6 miles. Next day, March 7th, we had the same experience that Shackleton mentions on several occasions. The morning began clear and fine, with a temperature of –40° Fahrenheit. In the course of the forenoon a breeze sprang up from the south-east and increased to a gale during the afternoon. The temperature rose rapidly, and when we pitched our camp at 3 in the afternoon it was only –0.4° Fahrenheit. At our camping place that morning we left a case of dogs' pemmican for use on the homeward journey, and marked the way to the south with splinters of board at every kilometre. Our distance that day was only 12½ miles. Our dogs, especially mine, looked miserable, terribly emaciated. It was clear that they could only reach 82° south at the farthest. Even then the homeward journey would be a near thing. We decided that evening to be satisfied with reaching 82°, and then return. During this latter part of the trip we put up our 2 tents, front to front, so that the openings joined. In this way we were able to send the food direct from one tent to the other without going outside, and this was a great advantage. This circumstance led to a radical alteration in our camping system, and gave us the idea of the best 5-man tent that has probably yet been seen in the polar regions. As we lay dozing that evening in our sleeping bags, thinking of everything and nothing, the idea suddenly occurred to us that if the tents were sewed together as they now stood, after the fronts had been cut away, we should get one tent that would give us far more room for 5 than the 2 separate tents as they were. The idea was followed up, and the fruit of it was the tent we used on the journey to the Pole, an ideal tent in every way. Yes, circumstances work wonders, for I suppose one need not make Providence responsible for these trifles. On March 8th we reached 82° south, and it was the utmost my 5 dogs could manage. Indeed, as will shortly be seen, it was already too much. They were completely worn out, poor beasts. This is the only dark memory of my stay in the south, the overtaxing of these fine animals. I had asked more of them than they were capable of doing. My consolation is that I did not spare myself either. To set this sledge, weighing nearly half a ton, in motion with tired out dogs was no child's play, and setting it in motion was not always the whole of it. Sometimes one had to push it forward until one forced the dogs to move. The whip had long ago lost its terrors. When I tried to use it, they only crowded together, and got the heads as much out of the way as they could. The body did not matter so much. Many a time, too, I failed altogether to get them to go, and had to have help. Then 2 of us shoved the sledge forward, while the third used the whip, shouting at the same time for all he was worth. How hard and unfeeling one gets under such conditions, how one's whole nature may be changed. I am naturally fond of all animals, and try to avoid hurting them. There is none of the sportsman's instinct in me. It would never occur to me to kill an animal, rats and flies excepted, unless it was to support life. I think I can say that in normal circumstances I loved my dogs, and the feeling was undoubtedly mutual. But the circumstances we were now in were not normal, or was it perhaps myself who was not normal? I have often thought since that such was really the case. The daily hard work and the object I would not give up had made me brutal. For brutal I was when I forced these 5 skeletons to haul that excessive load. I feel it yet when I think of Thor, a big, fine, smooth-haired dog, uttering his plaintive howls on the march, a thing one never hears a dog do while working. I did not understand what it meant, would not understand perhaps. On he had to go, on till he dropped. When we cut him open we found that his whole chest was one large abscess. The altitude at noon gave us 81 degrees, 54 minutes and 30 seconds, and we therefore went another 6 miles to the south and pitched our camp at 3:30 p.m. in 82 degrees south. We had latterly had a constant impression that the Barrier was rising, and in the opinion of us all we ought now to have been at a height of about 1,500 feet and a good way up the slope leading to the Pole. Personally, I thought the ground continued to rise to the south. It was all imagination, as our later measurements showed. We had now reached our highest latitude that autumn, and had reason to be well satisfied. We laid down 1,370 pounds here, chiefly dogs' pemmican. We did nothing that afternoon, only rested a little. The weather was brisk, clear and calm, -13 degrees Fahrenheit. The distance this last day was 13½ miles. Next day we stayed where we were, built our depot and marked it. The marking was done in the same way as in 81 degrees south, with this difference, that here the pieces of packing cases held small dark blue stripes of cloth fastened to the top, which made them easier to see. We made this depot very secure, so that we could be certain it would stand bad weather in the course of the winter. I also left my sledge behind, as I saw the impossibility of getting it home with my team. Besides which, an extra sledge at this point might possibly be useful later. This depot, 12 feet high, was marked with a bamboo and a flag on the top, so that it could be seen a great way off. On March 10th we took the road from home. I divided my dogs between Wisting and Hansen, but they got no assistance from these bags of bones, only trouble. The other 3 teams had held out well. There was hardly anything wrong to be seen with Hansen's. Wisting's team was looked upon as the strongest, but his dogs had got very thin. However, they did their work well. Wisting's sled had also been overloaded. It was even heavier than mine. Johansen's animals had originally been regarded as the weakest, but they proved themselves very tough in the long run. They were no racers, but always managed to scramble along somehow. Their motto was, "If we don't get there today, we'll get there tomorrow." They all came home. Our original idea was that the homeward journey should be a sort of pleasure trip, that we should sit on the sledges and take it easy, but in the circumstances this was not to be thought of. The dogs had quite enough to do with the empty sledges. The same day we reached the place where we had left a case of dogs' pemmican and camped there, having done 29 3/4 miles. The weather was cold and raw, temperature –25.6 degrees Fahrenheit. This weather took the last remnant of strength out of my dogs. Instead of resting at night, they lay huddled together and freezing. It was pitiful to see them. In the morning they had to be lifted up and put on their feet. They had not strength enough to raise themselves. When they had staggered on a little way and got some warmth into their bodies, they seemed to be rather better. At any rate they could keep up with us. The following day we did 24 3/4 miles, temperature –32.8 degrees Fahrenheit. On the 12th we passed the depot in 81 degrees south. The big pressure ridges to the east were easily visible, and we got a good bearing, which would possibly come in useful later for fixing the position of the depot. That day we did 24 3/4 miles, temperature –39° Fahrenheit. March 13 began calm and fine, but by half past 10 in the morning a strong wind had sprung up from the east-south east with thick driving snow. So as not to lose the tracks we had followed so far, we pitched our camp to wait till the storm was over. The wind howled and took hold of the tents, but could not move them. The next day it blew just as hard from the same quarter, and we decided to wait. The temperature was, as usual, with the wind in this quarter, –11.2° Fahrenheit. The wind did not moderate till 10:30 a.m. on the 15th, when we were able to make a start. What a sight there was outside! How were we going to begin to bring order out of this chaos? The sledges were completely snowed up, whips, ski bindings, and harnesses largely eaten up. It was a nice predicament. Fortunately we were well supplied with alpine rope, and that did for the harnesses. Spare straps came in for ski bindings, but the whips were not easy to make good. Hansen, who drove first, was bound to have a fairly serviceable whip. The others did not matter so much, though it was rather awkward for them. In some way or other he provided himself with a whip that answered his purpose. I saw one of the others armed with a tent pole, and he used it till we reached Framheim. At first the dogs were much afraid of this monster of a whip, but they soon found out that it was no easy matter to reach them with the pole, and then they did not care a scrap for it. At last everything seemed to be in order, and then we only had to get the dogs up and in their places. Several of them were so indifferent that they had allowed themselves to be completely snowed under, but one by one we got them out and put them on their feet. Thor, however, refused absolutely. It was impossible to get him to stand up. He simply lay and whined. There was nothing to be done but to put an end to him, and as we had no firearms it had to be done with an axe. It was quite successful. Less would have killed him. Wisting took the carcass on his sledge to take it to the next camp, and there cut it up. The day was bitterly cold, fog and snow with a southerly breeze, temperature –14.8° Fahrenheit. We were lucky enough to pick up our old tracks of the southern journey, and could follow them. Lurven, Wisting's best dog, fell down on the march and died on the spot. He was one of those dogs who had to work their hardest the whole time. He never thought of shirking for a moment. He pulled and pulled until he died. All sentimental feeling had vanished long ago. Nobody thought of giving Lurven the burial he deserved. What was left of him, skin and bones, was cut up and divided among his companions. On March 16 we advanced 17 miles. Temperature –29.2° Fahrenheit. Jens, one of my gallant "Three Musketeers," had been given a ride all day on Wisting's sledge. He was too weak to walk any longer. Thor was to have been divided among his companions that evening, but on account of the abscess in his chest we changed our minds. He was put into an empty case and buried. During the night we were wakened by a fearful noise. The dogs were engaged in a fierce fight, and it was easy to guess from their howls that it was all about food. Wisting, who always showed himself quickest in getting out of the bag, was instantly on the spot, and then it was seen that they had dug up Thor and were now feasting on him. It could not be said that they were hard to please in the way of food. Associations of ideas are curious things. Sauce hollandaise suddenly occurred to my mind. Wisting buried the carcass again, and we had peace for the rest of the night. On the 17th it felt bitterly cold, with –41.8° Fahrenheit, and a sharp snowstorm from the south-east. Lassesen, one of my dogs, who had been following the sledges loose, was left behind this morning at the camping place. We did not miss him till late in the day. Rasmus, one of the "Three Musketeers," fell to-day. Like Lurven, he pulled till he died. Jens was very ill, could not touch food, and was taken on Wisting's sledge. We reached our depot in 80° south that evening and were able to give the dogs a double ration. The distance covered was 21 3/4 miles. The surface about here had changed in our absence. Great, high snow waves were now to be seen in all directions. On one of the cases in the depot, Bjaaland had written a short message, besides which we found the signal arranged with Hassel, a block of snow on the top of the depot to show that they had gone by and that all was well. The cold continued persistently. The following day we had –41.8° Fahrenheit. Ola and Jens, the two survivors of the three musketeers, had to be put an end to that day. It was a shame to keep them alive any longer. And with them the three musketeers disappear from this history. They were inseparable friends, these three, all of them almost entirely black. At Flekkerö, near Christiansand, where we kept our dogs for several weeks before taking them on board, Rasmus had got loose and was impossible to catch. He always came and slept with his two friends, unless he was being hunted. We did not succeed in catching him until a few days before we took them on board, and then he was practically wild. They were all three tied up on the bridge on board, where I was to have my team, and from that day my close acquaintance with the trio is dated. They were not very civilly disposed for the first month. I had to make my advances with a long stick, scratch them on the back. In this way I insinuated myself into their confidence, and we became very good friends. But they were a terrible power on board. Wherever these three villains showed themselves, there was always a row. They loved fighting. They were our fastest dogs. In our races with empty sledges, when we were driving around Framheim, none of the others could beat these three. I was always sure of leaving the rest behind when I had them in my team. I had quite given up on Lassesen, who had been left behind that morning, and I was very sorry for it, as he was my strongest and most willing beast. I was glad, therefore, when he suddenly appeared again, apparently fit and well. We presumed that he had dug up Thor again and finished him. It must have been food that had revived him. From 80° south, home, he did remarkably good work in Wisting's team. That day we had a curious experience, which was useful for the future. The compass on Hanssen's sledge, which had always been reliability itself, suddenly began to go wrong. At any rate, it did not agree with the observations of the sun, which we fortunately had that day. We altered our course in accordance with our bearings. In the evening we took our things into the tent. The housewife, with scissors, pins, and needles, etc., had lain close against the compass. No wonder it turned rebellious. On March 19th we had a breeze from the south east and –45.4° Fahrenheit. Rather fresh, I find noted in my diary. Not long after we had started that morning, Hanssen caught sight of our old tracks. He had splendid eyesight, saw everything long before anyone else. Bjaaland also had good sight, but he did not come up to Hanssen. The way home was now straightforward, and we could see the end of our journey. Meanwhile a gale sprang up from the south east, which stopped us for a day. Temperature –29.2° Fahrenheit. Next day the temperature had risen, as usual, with the south east wind. We woke up to find it +15.8° Fahrenheit on the morning of the 21st. That was a difference that can be felt, and not an unpleasant one. We had had more than enough of –40°. It was curious weather that night, violent gusts of wind from the east and south east, with intervals of dead calm, just as if they came off high land. On our way northward that day we passed our flag No. 6, and then knew that we were 53 miles from Framheim. Pitched our camp that evening at 37 miles from the station, We had intended to take this stretch of the way in 2 days, seeing how tired the dogs were, but it turned out otherwise, for we lost our old tracks during the forenoon, and in going on we came too far to the east and high up on the ridge mentioned before. Suddenly Hansen sang out that he saw something funny in front. What it was he did not know. When that was the case, we had to apply to the one who saw even better than Hansen, and that was my glass. Up with the glass then, the good old glass that had served me for so many years. Yes, there was certainly something curious. It must be the Bay of Whales that we were looking down into. But what were those black things moving up and down? "They are our fellows hunting seals," someone suggested, and we all agreed. Yes, of course, it was so clear that there was no mistaking it. "I can see a sledge, and there's another, and there's a third." We nearly had tears in our eyes to see how industrious they were. "Now they're gone. No, there they are again. Strange how they bob up and down, those fellows." It proved to be a mirage. What we saw was Framheim with all of its tents. Our lads, we were sure, were just taking a comfortable midday nap, and the tears we were nearly shedding were withdrawn. Now we could survey the situation calmly. There lay Framheim, there was Cape Man's Head, and there West Cape, so that we had come too fast to the east. "Hurrah for Framheim! 7:30 this evening," shouted one. "Yes, that's all we can do," cried another, and away we went. We set our course straight for the middle of the bay. We must have got pretty high up, as we went down at a terrific pace. This was more than the forerunner could manage. He flung himself on a sledge as it went by. I had a glimpse of Hansen, who was busy making a whip handle as I passed. The soles of his feet were then very prominent. I myself was lying on Hansen's sled, shaking with laughter. The situation was too comical. Hansen picked himself up again just as the last sledge was passing and jumped on. We all collected in a mass below the ridge, sledges and dogs mixed up together. The last part of the way was rather hard work. We now found the tracks that we had lost early in the day. One dried fish after another stuck up out of the snow and led us straight on. We reached Framheim at 7 in the evening, half an hour earlier than we had thought. It was a day's march of 37 miles, not so bad for exhausted dogs. Lassesen was the only one I brought home out of my team. Odin, whom I had sent home from 81° south, died after arriving there. We lost altogether 8 dogs on this trip. 2 of Stubberud's died immediately after coming home from 81° south. Probably the cold was chiefly responsible. I feel sure that with a reasonable temperature they would have come through. The 3 men who had come home from 81° south were safe and sound. It is true that they had run short of food and matches the last day, but if the worst came to the worst they had the dogs. Since their return they had shot, brought in, cut up, and stowed away 50 seals, a very good piece of work. Lindström had been untiring during our absence. He had put everything in splendid order. In the covered passage round the hut he had cut out shells in the snow, filling them with slices of seal meat. Here alone there were steaks enough for the whole time we should spend here. On the outer walls of the hut, which formed the other side of the passage, he had put up shelves, and there all kinds of tinned foods were stored. All was in such perfect order that one could put one's hand on what one wanted in the dark. There stood salt meat and bacon by themselves, and there were fish cakes. There you read the label on the tin of caramel pudding, and you could be sure that the rest of the caramel puddings were in the vicinity. Quite right. They stood in a row, like a company of soldiers. Oh, Lindström, how long will this order last? Well, that was, of course, a question I put to myself in the strictest secrecy. Let me turn over my diary. On Thursday, July 27th, I find the following entry: "The provision passage turns our days into chaotic confusion. How my mind goes back to the time when one could find what one wanted without a light of any kind. If you put out your hand to get a plum pudding and shut it again, you could be sure it was a plum pudding you had hold of. And so it was throughout Lindström's department. But now, good heavens, I am ashamed to put down what happened to me yesterday. I went out there in the most blissful ignorance of the state of things now prevailing, and of course I had no light with me, for everything had its place. I put out my hand and grasped. According to my expectation, I ought to have been in possession of a packet of candles, but this experiment had failed. That which I held in my hand could not possibly be a packet of candles. It was evident from the feel that it was something of a woollen nature. I laid the object down, and had recourse to the familiar expedient of striking a match. Do you know what it was? A dirty old pair of pants. And do you want to know where I found it? Well, it was between the butter and the sweetmeats. That was mixing things up with a vengeance. But Lindström must not have all the blame. In this passage everyone was running backwards and forwards, early and late, and as a rule in the dark. And if they knocked something down on the way, I am not quite sure that they always stopped to pick it up again. Then he had painted the ceiling of the room white. How cosy it looked when we put our heads in that evening. He had seen us a long way off on the Barrier, the rascal, and now the table was laid with all manner of dainties. But seal steaks and the smell of coffee were what attracted us, and it was no small quantity that disappeared that evening. Home, the word had a good sound, wherever it may be, at sea, on land, or on the Barrier. How comfortable we made ourselves that night! The first thing we did now was to dry all our reindeer skin clothes. They were wet through. This was not to be done in a hurry. We had to stretch the garments that were to be dried on lines under the ceiling of the room, so that we could not dry very much at a time. We got everything ready, and made some improvements in our outfit for a last depot journey before the winter set in. This time the destination was 80° south, with about 1.25 tons of fresh seal meat. How immensely important it would be on the main journey if we could give our dogs as much seal meat as they could eat at 80° south. We all saw the importance of this, and were eager to carry it out. We set to work once more at the outfit. The last trip had taught us much that was new. Thus Prestrud and Johansen had come to the conclusion that a double sleeping bag was preferable to 2 single ones. I will not enter upon the discussion that naturally arose on this point. The double bag has many advantages, and so has the single bag. Let it therefore remain a matter of taste. These two were, however, the only ones who made this alteration. Hansen and Wisting were busy carrying out the new idea for the tents, and it was not long before they had finished. These tents are as much like a snow hut in form as they can be. Instead of being entirely round, they have a more oblong form, but there is no flat side, and the wind has no point of attack. Our personal outfit also underwent some improvements. The Bay of Whales, the inner part of it, from Man's Head to West Cape, was now entirely frozen over. But outside, the sea lay immense and dark. Our house was now completely covered with snow. Most of this was Lindström's work. The blizzard had not helped him much. This covering with snow has a great deal to do with keeping the hut snug and warm. Our dogs, 107 in number, mostly look like pigs getting ready for Christmas. Even the famished ones that made the last trip are beginning to recover. It is an extraordinary thing how quickly such an animal can put on flesh. It was interesting to watch the homecoming of the dogs from the last trip. They showed no sign of surprise when we came into camp. They might have been there all the time. It is true they were rather more hungry than the rest. The meeting between Lassesen and Fix was comic. These two were inseparable friends. The first name was Boss, and the other obeyed him blindly. On the last trip I had left Fix at home, as he did not give me the impression of being quite up to the work. He had therefore put on a lot of flesh, big eater as he was. I stood and watched their meeting with intense curiosity. Would not Fix take advantage of the occasion to assume the position of boss? In such a mass of dogs it took some little time before they came across each other. Then it was quite touching. Fix ran straight up to the other, began to lick him, and showed every sign of the greatest affection and joy at seeing him again. Lassesen, on his part, took it all with a very superior air, as befits a boss. Without further ceremony he rolled his fat friend in the snow and stood over him for a while, no doubt to let him know that he was still absolute master, beyond dispute. Poor Fix, he looked quite crestfallen, but this did not last long. He soon avenged himself on the other, knowing that he could tackle him with safety. In order to give a picture of our life as it was at this time, I will quote a day from my diary. March 25th, Saturday. Beautiful mild weather, plus 6.8 degrees Fahrenheit, all day. Very light breeze from the southeast. Our seal hunters, the party that came home from 81 degrees south, were out this morning and brought back 3 seals. This makes 62 seals altogether since their return on March 11th. We have now quite enough fresh meat both for ourselves and for all our dogs. We get to like seal steak more and more every day. We should all be glad to eat it at every meal, but we think it safer to make a little variety. For breakfast, 8 o'clock, we now have regularly hot cakes with jam, and Lindstrom knows how to prepare them in a way that could not be surpassed in the best American houses. In addition we have bread, butter, cheese, and coffee. For dinner we mostly have seal meat. We introduced rather more tinned meat into the menu in the course of the winter, and sweets in the form of tinned Californian fruit, tarts, and tinned puddings. For supper, seal steak with wholeberry jam, cheese, bread, butter, and coffee. Every Saturday evening a glass of toddy and a cigar. I must frankly confess that I have never lived so well, and the consequence is that we are all in the best of health, and I feel certain that the whole enterprise will be crowned with success. It is strange indeed here to go outside in the evening and see the cosy warm lamplight through the window of our little snow-covered hut, and to feel that this is our snug, comfortable home on the formidable and dreaded barrier. All our little puppies, as round as Christmas pigs, are wandering about outside, and at night they lie in crowds about the door. They never take shelter under a roof at night. They must be hardy beasts. Some of them are so fat that they waddle just like geese. The aurora australis was seen for the first time on the evening of March 28th. It was composed of shafts and bends, and extended from the southwest to the northeast through the zenith. The light was pale green and red. We see many fine sunsets here, unique in the splendour of their colour. No doubt the surroundings in this fairyland of blue and white do much to increase their beauty. The departure of the last depot journey was fixed for Friday, March 31st. A few days before, the seal hunting party went out on the ice and shot 6 seals for the depot. They were cleaned and all superfluous parts removed so that they should not be too heavy. The weight of these 6 seals was then estimated at about 2,400 pounds. On March 31st at 10 a.m. the last depot party started. It consisted of 7 men, 6 sledges, and 36 dogs. I did not go myself this time. They had the most brilliant weather to begin their journey, dead calm and brilliantly clear. At 7 o'clock that morning, when I came out of the hut, I saw a sight so beautiful that I shall never forget it. The whole surroundings of the station lay in deep, dark shadow, in lee of the ridge to the east, but the sun's rays reached over the Barrier farther to the north, and there the Barrier lay golden red, bathed in the morning sun. It glittered and shone, red and gold, against the jagged row of mighty masses of ice that bounds our Barrier to the north. A spirit of peace breathed over all, but from Framheim the smoke ascended quietly into the air and proclaimed that the spell of thousands of years was broken. The sledges were heavily loaded when they went southward. I saw them slowly disappear over the ridge by the starting place. It was a quiet time that followed after all the work and hurry of preparation. Not that we two who stayed at home sat still doing nothing. We made good use of the time. The first thing to be done was to put our meteorological station in order. On April 1st all the instruments were in use. In the kitchen were hung over 2 mercury barometers, 4 aneroids, barograph, thermograph, and 1 thermometer. They were placed in a well-protected corner, farthest from the stove. We had no house as yet for our outside instruments, but the sub-director went to work to prepare one as quickly as possible, and so nimble were his hands that when the depot party returned, there was the finest instrument screen standing ready on the hill, painted white so that it shone a long way off. The wind vane was a work of art, constructed by our able engineer, Sundbeck. No factory could have sounded a more handsome or tasteful one. In the instrument screen we had a thermograph, hygrometer, and thermometers. Observations were made at 8 a.m., 2 p.m., and 8 p.m. When I was at home I took them, and when I was away it was Lindström's work. On the night before April 11th something or other fell down in the kitchen. According to Lindström, a sure sign that the travellers might be expected home that day. And sure enough, at noon we caught sight of them up at the starting place. They came across at such a pace that the snow was scattered all around them, and in an hour's time we had them back. They had much to tell us. In the first place, that everything had been duly taken to the depot in 80° south. Then they surprised me with an account of a fearfully crevassed piece of surface that they had come upon, 46½ miles from the station, where they had lost 2 dogs. This was very strange. We had now traversed this stretch of surface 4 times without being particularly troubled with anything of this sort, and then, all of a sudden, when they thought the whole surface was as solid as a rock, they found themselves in danger of coming to grief altogether. In thick weather they had gone too far to the west. Then, instead of arriving at the ridge as they had done before, they came down on to the valley, and there found a surface so dangerous that they nearly had a catastrophe. It was a precisely similar piece of surface to that already mentioned to the south of 81° south, but full of small hummocks everywhere. The ground was apparently solid enough, and this was just the most dangerous thing about it. But, as they were crossing it, large pieces of the surface fell away just in rear of them, disclosing bottomless crevices big enough to swallow up everything, man, dogs, and sledges. With some difficulty they got out of this ugly place by steering to the east. Now we knew of it, and we should certainly be very careful not to come that way again. In spite of this, however, we afterwards had an even more serious encounter with this nasty trap. One dog had also been left behind on the way. It had a wound on one of its feet and could not be harnessed in the sledge. It had been let loose a few miles to the north of the depot, doubtless with the idea that it would follow the sledges. But the dog seemed to have taken another view of the matter and was never seen again. There were some who thought that the dog had probably returned to the depot, and was now passing its days in ease and luxury among the laboriously transported seals' carcasses. I must confess that this idea was not very attractive to me. There was indeed a possibility that such a thing had happened, and that the greater part of our seal meat might be missing when we wanted it. But our fears proved groundless. Cook, that was the name of the dog, we had a Peary as well, of course, was gone for ever. The improved outfit was in every way successful. Praises of the new tent were heard on every hand, and Prestrud and Johansen were in the seventh heaven over their double sleeping bag. I fancy the others were very well satisfied with their single ones. And with this the most important part of the autumn's work came to an end. The foundation was solidly laid. Now we had only to raise the edifice. Let us briefly sum up the work accomplished between January 14th and April 11th. The complete erection of the station, with accommodation for 9 men for several years, provision of fresh meat for 9 men and 115 dogs for half a year. The weight of the seals killed amounted to about 60 tons, and finally the distribution of 3 tons of supplies in depots in latitudes 80°, 81°, and 82° south. The depot in 80° south contained seals' meat, dogs' pemmican, biscuits, butter, milk powder, chocolate, matches, and paraffin, besides a quantity of outfit. The total weight of this depot was 4,200 lbs. In 81° south, half a ton of dogs' pemmican; in 82° south, pemmican, both for men and dogs, biscuits, milk powder, chocolate, and paraffin, besides a quantity of outfit. The weight of this depot amounted to 1,366 lbs. End of Section 14. End of Chapter 6.